waking breath, it is getting increasingly harder to sell cars like this, or should I say engines like this. Just 7 years ago, there were at least 8 manufacturers selling cars with 12-cylinder engines. Today, that number's been cut in half. So we have to celebrate having these V12 engines, no matter what design encapsulates it. Or maybe we don't. Maybe EPA standards and emissions regulations have compromised these engines to the point of no longer being enjoyable. But that's what we're here to find out today with this car. This is the 12Cilindri Spider. It is not only Ferrari's latest V12 supercar, but it is currently the only two-door, two-seater V12 that Ferrari currently sells. So if you want a new Ferrari V12 front engine experience and you don't want the pure sangue, this is currently your only option. But is it a good one?
The 12Cilindri Spider follows up the 812 GTS that succeeds the F12, that succeeds the 599, and goes all the way back to the 365 GTB4 that inspires the very much controversial front fascia of the 12Cilindri. And unlike the 812 being very similar to its predecessor, the F12, this car is an all-new chassis with some interesting tricks up its sleeve.
I gotta say, the car definitely looks better in person. It certainly has a unique presence that's eye-catching, to say the least, although you could say the same thing about like a two-legged anteater. I definitely think the predecessor, the 812, is the better looking car for sure, right? But we've been here before. A new car comes out, everyone rags on the design, and then 20 years later, it's like the best thing ever. You gotta let it grow on you over time. Think of cars like the E60 M5 or the Ferrari F50. It's kind of like that girl you went to school with that you weren't really interested in then, but are kind of interested in now. Also, you should subscribe to this channel. Speaking of growing, the engine has been juicing a wee bit. We've still got the 6.5-liter V12 now pumping out 830 horsepower, which is insane, the amount of power they're able to extract from these motors without forced induction. It still spins to 9,500 glorious RPMs and has a few interesting tricks up its sleeve. The main one being ATS, aspirated torque shaping. This is essentially using electronics to smoothen the torque curve when accelerating from 3rd to 4th gear. It's kind of like having an adjustable shower head to be able to optimize degreasing your cheeks with optimal pressure based on the scenario. The car's a transaxle, so in the back is your transmission. It's a new 8-speed dual clutch that isn't new to Ferrari, but certainly new to the front engine V12 GT lineup. And not only is it 30% quicker than the dual clutch you had in the 812, but now you're getting that extra 8th gear, which then gives you lower highway cruising RPMs, which then helps your fuel economy, right? Because that's what the V12 guys want. They want lower emissions, saving the environment, right? Nah, honestly, I think we should change our whole emissions regulations to a merit-based system where you can keep your big old V10 or V12 engine based on how good the engine actually is. So engines like the W12 and the Bentleys would probably go away, but then stuff like this would stick around because it is so freaking good. It's the 830 horsepower that keeps you on your toes, but it is the sound of the engine that keeps you engaged because it is so good.
One trick that makes most engines like this absolutely scream is having things like equal length headers, which this car does have. But with noise pollution regulations and emission standards, it's getting harder and harder to have an exhaust system you can actually hear. But there's a very acceptable alternative to loud exhaust that most OEMs overlook, and that's the engine induction sound. Not the noises coming out of the exhaust, but the engine itself. And with tweaked intakes, resonators, and variable valves for this engine, Ferrari's V12 GT remains an audible treat even with the windows up.
I think one of the world's greater mysteries is why people would choose to do stuff like hard drugs versus just driving a naturally aspirated Ferrari V12. Although, I guess it isn't that much of a mystery when you factor in that most hard drugs don't cost $450,000 before options. But man, unlike that pesky China white, this V12 just does wonders for your soul. One of the best things about Ferrari GTs in the modern era is that you have a transmission that's truly able to go band for band with the engine in terms of performance. I was born during the F1, E-Gear, R-Tronic, SMG era of transmissions, and quite frankly, they're gearboxes. They're clunky, slow, and unreliable. But what you have here though is the ultimate dance partner for the V12, and it really just wakes the engine up in a way that the older transmissions simply never could. We all know that having a manual is going to be peak engagement for any sports car, right? But if you're gonna do an automatic, have it be the best possible automatic. I feel like that's the ultimate compromise in my book. And Ferrari's had the whole dual clutch transmission thing nailed down for quite some time. It is quite good. You have these massive paddle shifters, column mounted, so it can be a little tricky when doing some tight canyon carving, but for long swoops and roads like that, it's quite good. And you feel every shift, you know? Super violent. You get the proper response from the engine in terms of what you're hearing, what you're feeling, that chassis vibration. Yeah.
If we're going to talk about something Ferrari has never quite nailed, it's been the interior technology, especially in vehicles like the Purosangue that you would assume would have the best tech experience of all Ferraris. But maybe they've figured it out in this one?
Nah, not really, not 100%, but we're definitely heading in the right direction. So unlike Ferrari's family FUV, which you would think would have a similar setup, the 12Cilindri has a center screen which serves as your primary hub for all of your basic functions like climate control, and you have much more usable real estate for Apple CarPlay or Android Auto if you're a green bubble boy. And I definitely prefer this layout to what you just have, everything being on the digital gauge cluster like on the Purosangue and other Ferrari supercars. General fluidity of the UI isn't top tier. It's certainly a little slow to respond, especially with using a somewhat older iPhone for CarPlay that we've got in here for navigation. The smoothness isn't 100%, but compared to other NAV12 competitors, this is pretty much the best option, and that's because it is the only option. One thing that absolutely drives me up a wall, and has been in other Ferraris in the past, are these capacitive steering wheel buttons. I am just not a fan at all of it, at least upon initial use. I'm sure if I use this like every day for a month straight or longer, I could eventually lock in with it, but for just like using it for a day or two or 6 hours in our case, it's not great. I prefer just regular buttons. I hope the Ferrari dealer guys are not doing infotainment demos to potential customers, because that might be where you lose some people. Overall, Apple CarPlay connectivity for me works pretty well, and the general interaction with the infotainment and the setup is miles better than what you have in other Ferraris on sale right now, minus the Roma, I guess. But I feel like Ferrari is a brand that's so conducive to having those physical touch points in the car that remind you that you're in something that's outrageously expensive, which this is. And if everything you touch is a screen or a haptic switch, I feel like you're missing out on that experience. And so I know Ferrari is probably going to stay the course with this interior philosophy, but if there's any chance you'd consider having more of an analog blend, please Ferrari, please do.
Probably the biggest standout of the interior experience that I didn't expect was the 1600 watt Burmester sound system that's pretty good. And coming from the JBL sound system that they used in the prior 812 GTS, Ferrari has absolutely locked in with this one.
Outside of the engine and transmission theater, this car is also dynamically really impressive, and the two major things that are allowing for that is the PCV 3.0 system that gives you a semi-active mag ride, which makes the car generally pretty usable on most dry road conditions. And then you also have individual rear wheel steer and torque vectoring, which makes this car more capable in the corners than most of its competitors, which, like I mentioned, is a very small list. This car definitely doesn't have the athletic agility of lighter Ferrari models like the 296 GTB, for example, but with all the electromechanical assists you've got in the car, it's genuinely confident and capable on some canyon roads. You know that one kid you went to like middle school with who was kind of heavier set, but then as soon as you guys start playing flag football in gym class, he'd just start flying like a track star? Yeah, this car is him. I don't think this car would necessarily be the best Ferrari to choose for track use necessarily, but for the street, I think this might be peak Ferrari in terms of how much you can enjoy it at least under legal road limits.
And unlike performance cars of the past, the Spider version isn't compromised compared to its coupe sibling. Weight is up by about 130 pounds with the convertible mechanism, but torsional rigidity is within earshot of the coupe, the little trunk space you do get remains identical, and there's cool little aero tricks in play to make sure the Spider is just as capable at the limit as the coupe. The main one being these little slits for airflow right behind your head.
And speaking of aero, you've got these pretty slick active aero winglets in the back that give you up to 110 pounds of extra downforce at 155 miles an hour. But even more important than the downforce is how pretty sick it looks, especially when viewing the car from the rear. And it's just one of those things that makes it stand out from the 812 that never had any sort of active aero mechanism. A lot of cars today drive technically better than cars of the past, but that's mostly because they have to, with all these complicated hybrid, ADAS, and all-wheel drive systems that make the cars bigger and heavier and just harder to move at higher speeds. This car drives better than the 812, but not because Ferrari needed to compensate for something that compromises the experience, but just because Ferrari wanted to make a better GT than what they did before. And with everything they've done to this car, although, you know, it's gonna take a while to get used to the looks, I think they've succeeded in making another proper driver's GT. Ah.
Il 12 cilindri resta sempre la macchina originale della Ferrari quando lei pensa che nel 1946 è nato il 12 cilindri 1500 cm3. Quindi tutto il resto è una derivazione del modello originale.
I feel like every week the story changes on how much longer a car like this can stick around. It could be 10 months from now, it could be 10 years from now, we really don't know. We're kind of in this seesaw automotive era where things could go either way. So I'm going to live out my V12 dreams like there's no tomorrow, starting with buying my very own 812 Superfast in Rosso Corsa Red and wrapping it in Lamborghini Green. But I'm only going to do that if this video gets 400,000 likes, so get to work. Look at this thing. Old flat nose head ass. Old long face head ass. Old skin tone, chicken bone, leave me alone head ass. Old super knuckle, knuckle, bill buckle, banana truffle head ass.